Good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN AM from Friday, October 15th, 2021. And our top story today, ESG factors may be financially material for investments in your 401k plan. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Kevin Walsh is a principal with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Kevin, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Jeff, it's always good being on, and I know for listeners to the weekly podcast, they've been hearing me talk a lot about new Department of Labor rules that were pending, and today's an exciting day because we're going to get an opportunity to talk about them as they've come out.
All right, let's break it down, Kevin. So these dropped on, I think it was Wednesday. It's now Friday. So let's talk through your analysis, what this means. Well, maybe not what it means, but let's just break down what this all says.
Yeah, let's break this down. So on October 14th, the Department of Labor published a new rule in the Federal Register, a proposed rule in the Federal Register, which is designed to update kind of the framework for fiduciaries when they're considering investments for factors that may not be, the traditional pure economic factors. We like to call them ESG factors. In the Trump administration, they did a similar rulemaking, and in their early version, they called them ESG factors. The final Trump rule and this rule don't use ESG, but for purpose of the discussion, what this rule is all about, it's about, when fiduciaries are allowed to make ESG-related investment decisions and when they have to vote proxies related to investments they have.
All right, Kevin. So financially material, that is what I took out of this. And again, I didn't read, I skimmed, right? So I just read the executive summary, saw the press release. The ESG factors are financially material. This kind of a sea change from where we were in the Trump administration, obviously. These are proposed rules, but what does that mean to you? Financially material.
So these are a bit of a sea change, but I do think it's also a bit of a messaging change. In the Trump administration, you were allowed to take ESG factors into account if they had a pecuniary impact. Here they're using the term, financially material, and they give an example in the preamble where they're talking a whole bunch about how, environmental factors can often be material. And they describe it as they could be material for two reasons. One is, there's the impact of climate change on businesses, both in a cost standpoint and also, if you're investing in products that are going to help mitigate or prevent additional climate change, there might be some upside there, as well as the downside of the economic consequences. The second way they signal that it could be material is that, the impact of government regulation existing in future. The Labor Department at least signals that they think that the regulation around companies that are doing environmental harm or that are perceived to be doing environmental harm is likely to impact their investment performance going forward. So, they don't come out and say climate change is always material, but they do signal that, they think that fiduciaries will frequently be evaluating the impact of climate change. And that's the sea change. In the Trump administration rule, it was similar from a regulatory text standpoint, but the implication was that, we think you're rarely going to take these outside factors into account. The Biden administration, they're using a similar framework, but when they look at this, they think that climate change is the most prominent factor that they describe. But they rattle off a list of factors that they think that a prudent fiduciary might consider if it's material. So bear with me, viewers, because this is where I'm going to read for a second.
Absolutely. We're not expecting you 18 hours in to commit this all to memory, Kevin. At least I'm not. I don't think the viewers have high expectations.
The viewers have high expectations. But so they give three categories of examples. They say, climate change related factors, such as a corporation's exposure to the real and potential effects of climate change, including its exposure to the physical and transitional risks of climate change and positive or negative effects of government regulations, to governance factors, such as those involving board composition, executive compensation, and transparency and accountability in corporate decision-making, as well as a corporation's avoidance of criminal liability and compliance with labor, employment, environmental, tax, and other applicable laws and regulations. And 3, workforce practices, including the corporation's progress on workforce diversity, inclusion, and other drivers of employee hiring, promotion, and retention, its investment in training to develop its workforce's skill, equal employment opportunity, and labor relations. So, the Biden administration in this proposal is kind of, they're applying the same framework or a very similar framework to the Trump administration, but instead of cautioning folks about considering these factors, they're coming out and saying, not only can E, S, and G be material, but here are specific factors within E, within S, and within G that the administration has identified as being particularly noteworthy.
Yeah. Kevin, just a last question before we go to commercial break. Does this rule go as far as to define what ESG is? Because I know you just laid out some of the factors, very detailed information. A lot of people put a lot of thought into this. That's very clear. But, does it really say what ESG is or sustainability is? Or is that still open to interpretation, I guess, for lack of a better term?
So Jeff, that's a great question. And I think folks are very focused on what ES and G are. But the thing that the department's focused on is, when can you take into account factors that aren't purely, economic factors, or when can you take into account factors that aren't obviously economic factors? And so, they're providing examples within the E, S, and G world, but this analysis isn't limited to just E, S, and G factors. If there were other factors, and they have one listed in as an example later, which is, would including an investment option within your plan increase the likelihood that your employees participate in the plan? Would it increase the likelihood that your company is able to retain its employees? So those aren't pure ESG factors, yet there are examples in here. So I think the department's designed this to be, ESG inclusive instead of being ESG exclusive.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk to Kevin about what this all means for employers that sponsor retirement plans and the employees that participate in them. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Are you over 50? Would you like to get up to 33% more income in retirement? Then call now for this free book, Annuity Do's and Don'ts for Baby Boomers. This free book reveals little-known secrets about annuity strategies that will help you make the right choices before buying an annuity. Call right now for your free book, and as a bonus, we'll also throw in a free annuity rate report, both absolutely free for calling Annuity General today.
Call 800-504-8194.
Welcome back. We're talking to Kevin Walsh this morning. He's a principal with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Kevin, thanks so much for staying with us this morning.
Jeff, you're giving away your Baltimore roots. I mean,
Good old
you love
Baltimore.
saying Washington.
Washington, that's right, Okay, Kevin, just before we get into the impact here, and I want to talk about what this means for sponsors of retirement plans, et cetera, but this is a proposed rule, 60-day comment period. What's that mean?
So what that means is that, the department, they met with stakeholders since the beginning of the year because they knew this was an initiative they were working on. They then crafted this proposed rule, taking into account the input of the stakeholders as well as the administration. And now that the rule's been published on October 14th, they've provided, the regulated community, participants, beneficiaries, anyone who wants to write a letter. I mean, there's no rules about who can write a letter here. Anybody who wants to comment, an opportunity to, submit comments to the Labor Department between now and December 13th. And then before this is finalized, before, companies and plans are forced to comply with this rule, the department will go through those comments, evaluate whether they should make changes, revise the rule as applicable, and then publish a final rule. But so where we are now is they've come out with this saying, this is where we think we want to go. This is what we think makes sense. So please tell us whether you think this makes sense or if we need to make tweaks.
Yeah, I have a feeling that mailbag is going to be almost as big as Santa Claus is this year. All right, Kevin, let's talk about what this means first for employers that sponsor retirement plans, whether it's a 401k, a pension, a 403b, any type of employee benefit plan. What should they potentially be thinking about with this proposed rule?
Well, so with this proposed rule, I think employers should be kind of thinking about a couple of things. One is, do they like the increased flexibility to consider additional factors? Some plan sponsors might think this is a great opportunity with things being, to include new investment options that may be attractive for, employees who would like to see certain types of investments or that are consistent with the company's mission. Other employers might think that, this is not the best idea, that, it's already an ESG good that we're offering a retirement plan. And what we ought to be doing is just merely, maximize the amount of the returns. So if you're on either side of that fence, it's probably worth thinking about it. And this rule wouldn't force you to take those factors into account. But, seeing whether or not this is important to you. Helpfully from a plan sponsor standpoint, the prior Trump administration rule had required additional documentation when you were taking non-pecuniary or ESG factors into account. This rule would take away those requirements. It also would allow you to take ESG into account when you're picking your default investment option. So it provides more flexibility to employers. And it just comes down to, do you prefer flexibility or not? I tend to favor flexibility because I think it's tougher to trip a test if you have some flexibility. But, it could lead to situations where employees are pressuring a plan sponsor into including certain types of options that they'd prefer not to include. So that's a good area to think about whether you want to comment between here and December 13th.
And Kevin, does this mean potentially that you need to update your IPS, your investment policy statement, to include some of this proposed language or final language once it's finalized? What's the feeling there? Or you just kind of leave it as is and you leave it as flexible as possible, to your point earlier?
So in terms of an investment policy statement, it'll be worth taking a look at your investment policy statement once this rule's finalized. I always caution folks that, proposed rules are proposed rules. And if you go and make changes based on a proposed rule, you might not be complying with existing law, because until it's finalized, it's not a real thing. I would expect companies to take a look at their investment policy statements after this rule is finalized, if it's finalized. The area where I think plan sponsors will want to be most, diligent would be on the proxy voting side of this. The Trump administration rule in this area had provided a couple of safe harbors on proxy voting, which the Biden Labor Department viewed as rules that would essentially deter the voting of proxies. In this proposed rule, they've eliminated those safe harbors. So if you amended your investment policy statement in 2020 to take advantage of those safe harbors, if this rule is finalized without being changed, or if it's finalized with changes that don't match your safe harbors, it'll certainly be worth taking a look at your investment policy statement to, come back into compliance.
Kevin, in terms of, you and your colleagues at Groom don't necessarily work with participants, but in terms of thinking about what you need to communicate or not communicate, in communication, as I know you're very passionate about missing participants and a lot of other issues, right? I don't want to bring that up. That's kind of going down a rabbit hole.
We only have so much time. This is a brand new rule.
We've got about 2 minutes late. But what should we be thinking about if we are sponsors, employers, about our participants? Is this something where, currently, by my estimation, just looking at some of the platforms, 1% to 3% of money today in these retirement plans is allocated to some type of social or ESG type investment. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a flood of interest from participants. So what should sponsors be thinking about when it comes to communicating and educating plan participants in these plans?
So I think for plan sponsors, some of it's going to come down to, where they view their corporate philosophy from ESG. This could be an opportunity to educate your participants that these rules could make it easier to include, ESG options or ESG factors within investment options, including the default. The key with communicating to participants will be making clear that, while these factors can be taken into account, plan fiduciaries still can't, they can't sacrifice return or take on increased risk to incorporate these factors. So some of this messaging will be, comforting employees that, when we take these social goals or other goods into account, we're not, sacrificing your retirement. So I think that's a key messaging piece. And then the other, if you've got a plan that has a low participation rate, if you've got a plan where, folks are rolling out as soon as they can, it might be worth considering communicating with participants that the plan may be able to and may consider including options that better align with the social good that the participants want to support as a way of, increasing participation and increasing retention to keep folks within the plan.
Kevin, does this expand? I lied that it's not the last question. This is the last question. Does this expand? These fiduciary meetings where, quarterly reviews that you participate in, I used to participate in, so many advisors participate in with fiduciaries. Does this further expand the purview about what we're talking about? So it's not just returns on the returns, right? The returns versus the benchmark, the IPS, some of the legal framework or the regulatory framework. But does this now include ESG, potentially include ESG type conversations? What are we doing as an organization? What's the mission of our retirement plan? I could see this kind of ballooning into a 3 or 4 hour meeting from a 2 hour meeting.
Well, so it could expand the length of a meeting, but fiduciaries are still required to take the risk adjusted return as the primary basis they're making decisions. So to the extent that you're able to avoid sacrificing return or increase risk, you may see fiduciaries spend more time focusing on ESG and these other goals. So to a degree, we could see some meetings in the next few years if this is finalized or longer, where plan fiduciaries are working with consultants or working with others to figure out what factors really could drive long-term performance. Because you could see if you're a defined benefit plan with a 30-year horizon, some factors might be material. And I think in here the Biden administration suggests that climate change would or is likely to be a factor that could be material. But for other plan sponsors, if you have a defined contribution plan and you have high turnover and participants participate for 1 to 5 years, those same factors may not be material. So I think in the near term there's going to be a fair amount of work for plan sponsors who are looking to incorporate these factors or who are looking to figure out if they're material or not, in working with consultants and diligently evaluating the financial considerations.
Yeah, well, certainly we've got 60 days, or not you and I, but the people have 60 days to weigh in here and in the proposed rules, and it's going to be interesting to follow this thing. It's like this long and winding road, to quote the Beatles. Kevin Walsh, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back on again very soon.
No, it's always great being on the show, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
That wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a topic of interest that somebody you think we should talk to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. We're back again tomorrow, this time for BRN Weekly. We'll have a very special guest and we'll take a look at some of our best segments for the week. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.